For years, I've seen these amazing Milky Way panoramic photos online, and I always wanted to try and go and create one of them myself. This year, I decided to do just that. I waited until the weather conditions were right and the Milky Way was going to be in the right position. I stayed up really late, and I came up with this Milky Way panoramic image. In this video, I'm going to show you how I created this panorama, and I used a slightly more advanced workflow just to get the least amount of noise possible. Let's head into the computer, and I'll show you how I did it. So I've got all of the photos in this raw folder. These are all images taken on my Sony a7R IV, and if we head over to Lightroom, I've also imported this raw folder down here. So we've got 49 photos in total. We're not actually going to create a 49 photo wide panoramic image, but we will make use of all of these photos. I'll show you why in just a minute. So the first thing we're going to do is edit this first image. Just going to hit D to go to Develop Module. All of these photos were shot at ISO 3200 at f2.2 on my 20mm Sony 1.8G. Let's start off by increasing the exposure a little bit, just to bring out a bit more of those details in the stars. We'll go just a little bit over 1, maybe about 1.23. I'm also going to just cool down the image a bit by just reducing the temperature, just so we get more of a kind of a blue look to the Milky Way. So somewhere about 4105. I'm going to leave the tint set at +14. Just going to close the basic section here, and I'm going to come down to the detail section. What I'm going to do is make sure we don't have any sharpening applied, because we're going to do some extra processing to these images in just a minute. We can go and add sharpening into the final panoramic image at the end. I'm also going to make sure that noise reduction here is set to 0, and also color noise reduction is set to 0. That's because we're going to handle the noise differently in just a moment. If we wanted to, we could try and add a little bit of extra brightness in the shadows here, just to bring out the foreground area, but notice there's quite a lot of noise here. I'm actually not going to do that in this image. So we've got some very basic light editing there. I'm going to hit G to go back to the grid view. And I'm just going to hold down Control and use the mouse wheel to zoom out a little bit here. What I'm going to do is make sure this first photo that we just edited is selected. I'm going to hold down Shift and select the final image at the bottom here. Next, I'm going to come over to the sidebar, come down to this Sync Settings button and click it. And I'm going to make sure that Check All is selected and click Synchronize. This will copy the developed settings from that first image that we edited to all of the other images. So for example, if we go and look at one of these middle images, I'll just hit E, you can see that we've brightened this up with the same developed settings. If I just use Control and the mouse wheel to zoom back in again, you can see that each of these images is actually the same frame. So I took 7 individual photos before I went and moved the camera around a little bit to capture the next part of the Milky Way for the panoramic image. The reason why I took the same photo 7 times is because I want to make use of a technique called stacking to reduce the noise as much as possible before we go and actually stitch together the final panoramic image. I'm just going to zoom back out here, and what I'm going to do to make this a bit more obvious is I'm going to apply a color label to the first image in each set of 7. So for example, let's choose yellow, and if we move 7 images along, the 8th image will be the next frame. Once again, I'm going to set a color label of yellow and do this for each set of 7. Now we can see we've got 7 yellow photos. Each one of these represents the first in a set of 7 images. So in the final panoramic image, we're going to end up stitching 7 images. So what we're going to do is export the first set of 7 images here. I'm just going to select all 7 and just right click and choose export. At the top here, I'm going to choose an export location. So what I'm going to do next to this raw folder where the original images are, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it For Stacking, and select that folder as the export output. I'm going to make use of this file renaming section here. Basically, this is going to add a number for each of the 7 frames or 7 photos that we selected. Each one of these will be prefixed with P1. P1 just stands for panel 1 of the final panorama that we're going to stitch. For the export file settings, I've got TIFF here to maintain maximum quality. I've made sure I've turned compression off, and I've also chosen 16 bits for maximum quality. Notice here that I've turned off sharpening because we want to do the sharpening manually at the end of the process. So now I'm just going to click export, and once Lightroom has done its thing, if we head back to File Explorer here and head into the For Stacking folder, notice now we've got 7 TIFFs and Lightroom's automatically named them 1 of 7, 2 of 7, and so on. We now need to do exactly the same thing for the next set of 7. Once again, choose export. We're going to leave all of the settings the same, except now we're going to change this to P2. We'll do the same for the next set of 7, and so on. And for the final set of 7, we'll rename them to P7. If we have a look at this list of files now, we've got each set of 7 for each panel of the panoramic image that we're going to create, all the way up to panel 7. So now we've got these sets of 7 images, we're going to use a process called stacking to reduce the noise in each panel of the panorama before we go and stitch it together. I'm going to use a program called Sequitur or Sequator here for this. Check out the link in the description for a tutorial if you want to learn more about this application. So what we're going to do is double click on Start Images, and we're going to select the For Stacking folder, and we're going to select the first set of 7. Just click Open. The next thing I'm going to do is choose an output file. I'm going to create a new folder for this called Stacked, and we'll call this first stacked image P1. Just click Save. The next thing we want to do here is come to Composition, choose Freeze Ground, and then come up to Sky Region, and we're going to draw in a mask here just to tell Sequitur which part of the image is the stars and which part is the land. I'm going to come down to this Reduce Distortion Effects, and I'm going to make sure this is set to complex because we shot this with a wide angle lens. And then we can just hit the Start button down here, and Sequitur will do its thing. It's going to stack all of the 7 images and try and work out where the noise is and where the stars are, and remove the noise. So that's the first set of 7 done. We now need to repeat this process for panel 2. What I'm going to do is come up to Start Images and right click, choose Remove All, double click again, and this time we're going to choose panel 2 1 of 7 to panel 2 7 of 7 and click Open. We'll change the output file name to P2, and because now we've moved the camera around and we've got the land in a different place, once again we need to tell Sequitur where the stars are and where the land is. And once again click Start. This will process all of the 7 images in panel 2 and once again reduce the noise. We just need to follow the same process now for each of the remaining sets of 7 images. Okay, that's the final set of 7 images stacked. You can see in this stacked folder that we've got these 7 images that were created in Sequitur. So now we can go and stitch these together. The first thing we need to do is go and add the folder that we just created. I'm going to click this little plus icon, choose Add Folder, and we're going to navigate to the stacked folder. This is the one that contains those 7 stacked images. We can see P1 to P7 here. I'm just going to click Import. And now down here in this stacked folder, we've got the 7 stacked images. So it's these images that we're actually going to stitch together. So I'm just going to select this first one and the last one, right click, and come down to Photo Merge and choose Panorama. We'll just let Lightroom do its thing, and you can play with these settings such as auto crop, and also choose between spherical, which is going to give us this wider looking image, and cylindrical, which is going to give us this taller image. I'm actually going to choose cylindrical. I'm not going to choose auto crop or auto settings because I want to go and crop it manually in just a minute. So let's go and click merge. This might take a short while for Lightroom to do its thing. And now we can see here we've got the stitched panoramic image, and we can hit D to go back into the Develop tab and make any final tweaks. The first thing I'm actually going to do is create the crop that I want. So I'm just going to click the crop tool here, and I'm just going to go and create the look that I want for this particular image. You can always hit L on the keyboard to give you a preview of what the crop will look like without all of the distracting Lightroom user interface. So I don't mind that too much. I think there's just a little bit more space than I'd like at the top there. And I'm just going to pull a little bit of this in from the side just to try and make the final image a bit more symmetrical when it comes to the Milky Way arch itself. I'm just going to hit enter to apply that crop. Let me just go and hide these images at the bottom, and we'll make sure we've got Navigator open. So now we can go and make some final tweaks to this image. For example, we could add a bit of extra contrast. We could try and bring out the highlights a little bit more. We could try and bring out the whites a little bit more. we could head into the tone curve here and make some changes to these regions. We could increase the lights a little bit to bring out some more of that starlight and some more of the gas or nebula. And we could do the same thing with the highlight region here. And that's a pretty good starting point for this image. If you want to make the image look a little bit softer and a little bit dreamy, you can actually reduce the dehaze amount. I know that sounds a bit strange, but watch what happens as I reduce this down. You can see it kind of makes the Milky Way look a little bit more softer and dreamier. I wouldn't push this too much though, so we'll just add a slight, or reduce I should say, a slight amount of dehaze. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a graduated filter here over this land. Let's drag that up a little bit. And what I want to do, just double click on Effect to reset that. I'm just going to add a very small amount of shadow boosting here and a very small amount of exposure. We don't want to introduce too much noise into those shadow areas. What I want to do is actually draw attention to the Milky Way. So what I'm going to do is grab a radial filter here, and we'll just start by drawing this out. We're going to move this over the Milky Way area itself. Basically, we're kind of creating a manual vignette around this Milky Way section. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because I want to darken the stars in these corners to draw attention to the Milky Way. So if you hit O on your keyboard, this red overlay lets you visualize things like the feathering. Obviously we don't want a really harsh vignette like that, that'll look terrible. So I'm going to go for a very soft feather, but to make this work I'm going to zoom out a bit and just pull this really quite wide over the edge of the photo. Just reposition that, maybe even a little bit wider there. So it's really soft vignette. Pull it down a little bit just to highlight the arch of the Milky Way. Hit O to turn off the visualization. And then we can come and make some changes here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to drop the highlights and the whites. That's going to reduce some of the starlight and also the overall exposure. If I go too far, it's going to look a bit too dramatic for my liking. So somewhere about there should do it. Now we're starting to draw attention to the Milky Way itself. The next thing I'm going to do is add another radial filter. This is kind of going to do the opposite. We're going to brighten up this section of the Milky Way. So we're going to use more of a narrow oval here for this. Once again, hit O to visualize this. Make sure it's nice and feathered. And now we can go and add a little touch of exposure. We just need to click the invert button so it affects everything inside the radial mask. And you can see that's a bit too bright really. So let's just give that a little bit more brightness for the Milky Way itself. We don't want to go too far. That's too overblown. So pretty subtle, and if we wanted to we could experiment with adding a little bit of clarity there. Don't really like that too much, but I'm just going to add a very small amount. And for a few finishing touches, I'm going to add another radial mask down here, just over this water area at the bottom. Once again click invert, and I'm just going to add a very slight touch of exposure here, maybe about 0.5. And then we can zoom in down here, and we can just try and bring out these reflections. You can see we've got a few hot pixels there that we could also deal with. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial, otherwise it will take even longer. So I'm just going to use an adjustment brush here, and I'll just max out the exposure. But what I'm going to do is make sure this flow is really low, maybe even as low as 5. Use the square brackets on the keyboard, and then just draw some strokes down here, just to bring out a little bit of those reflections. Recall up until this point we haven't applied any sharpening, so as the final stage here we'll come down to the detail tab and we'll go and apply some sharpening. We'll just increase this, we'll probably go about the 40 mark. If you hold down Alt and then click and drag this mask slider, you can select where the sharpening is going to be applied. So I'm just going to apply the sharpening to the stars only, and that's the final image. What I'm going to do now is export this final high-res version and put it up on screen for you to see. If you're interested in landscape photography or astrophotography and you want more tutorials like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future videos. Alright, let's have a look at this final image. I'm Jason Roberts and I'll see you in the next one.